Dear viewers, welcome to the first of a series of events dedicated to Ukraine at the Cambridge Festival. My name is Andriy Smetnyuk. I am a senior teaching associate at the Slavonic section at the University of Cambridge. And this particular event is dedicated to the question of the Ukrainian economy, specifically during the wartime. And even more specifically than that, not during the entire period of war that started in 2014, but rather since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th this year. It is a little bit hard to speak about economy when people are dying in Ukraine. And according to the United Nations, 1,417 civilians were killed, out of which 121 children. And as of today, around 340 bodies of people who were brutally killed in a massacre in the town of Bucha were found. But in times like these, it is important to discuss economic matters as well, as they provide insight into how Western countries can support Ukrainian people and government, and also understand what is the economic impact of the war, as this information will be then important for when it comes to rebuilding Ukraine. We also use this event to raise funds for a humanitarian help fund set up by the Embassy of Ukraine to the United Kingdom, and the information about it will be down below in the chat. And this being said, I would like to introduce our today's speakers. Dr. Tymofiy Mylovanov, former Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Agriculture of Ukraine. Dr. Andrei Kirilenko, Professor of Finance and Director of the Doctoral Program at the Cambridge Judge Business School. And Dr. Alexander Rodnyansky, Assistant Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge and member of the Supervisory Board of the State Savings Bank of Ukraine. Thank you very much for coming here. And for our viewers, please leave your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom. And I will be now passing the floor to Anna Belus, PhD candidate in development studies here at the University of Cambridge, and also a public sector specialist at the World Bank, who will introduce the speakers in more detail and will moderate this event. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andriy, for the introductions. My name is Anna Belus, as Andriy mentioned. I'm a PhD candidate here at Cambridge. I also have an honor of teaching at the Kyiv School of Economics, which has been a pleasure. We've had wonderful students who are all civil servants or young politicians, very ambitious and always willing to change Ukraine for the better. So today we are speaking about the economic impact of war. As you understand, this is a very important topic. It is not the first year that Ukraine is functioning, Ukrainian economy is functioning under the conditions of war. As you know, the current Russian aggression has started on the 24th of February, but the war with Russia, in fact, started 8 years ago. So Ukrainian economy has had some experience of dealing with the war, yet now obviously the situation is at a completely different scale, and we've gathered today to bring the best minds to start a discussion on how to measure the impacts of war. What are those impacts? What are we seeing to date? Obviously, all of you who follow the events in Ukraine know that the devastation, and as Andriy has mentioned as well, the devastation is unimaginable. Some cities are practically being wiped out from Earth. And we have to consider not only the direct devastation caused by the war, but also the slowing down economic activity and the impact of the war and relocation, essentially, of a population from different regions of Ukraine. So without further ado, I wanted to invite our speakers, whom Andrei has introduced, to make their contributions. We decided not to limit our speakers. They have 10 minutes to voice their concerns, their observations on the matter of the impact of war on the economy. And after that, we'll start a discussion. So please, as you listen to each of the speakers, please voice your questions under the Q&A session. We will collect them and then we'll start a discussion afterwards. We will focus mainly on the banking sector and the impact on the financial sector, but other questions and other contributions are equally welcome. So the order of speakers is as follows. First, we'll hear from Dr. Tymofiy Mylovanov, as Andrei has mentioned, a Ukrainian economist, also the president of the Kyiv School of Economics, wonderful academic, person who does a lot and works also as an advisor to the President Zelensky. Tymofiy was also one of the ministers in the previous government, and he led the reforms, the land reforms that were crucial to the development of Ukrainian economy. Then we'll follow on to listen to the contribution from Dr. Andrei Korolenko, Professor of Finance, Director of Doctoral Program at Cambridge Judge Business School. Dr. Korolenko also was very much involved in development of Ukraine and visited Ukraine on multiple occasions. Incidentally, I know from a colleague that Dr. Korolenko also published a book about the incredible contributions of Ukrainian scientists to the development of the IT industry in its early days. We'll hear from Andrei Korolenko, and towards the end, we'll listen to Dr. Andriy Rodnyansky, an assistant professor of economics at the University of Cambridge, who's worked a lot and worked as a chief economic advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine since 2019. So this is the order. Please listen carefully, and I'm passing on the floor to Dr. Tymofiy Mylovanov.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So thank you for making time to engage and think about Ukraine. I can't talk about economics really all the time. I think it's important to talk about what actually happens in Ukraine too, outside of economic aspects. We have seen Bucha and Irpin and Trostenets, where there have been real atrocities committed by the Russian troops. We have seen it over the last 2 days, but we've recently also talked to many people. My sister talked to many people who are in Brovary region, and Brovary, this is on the other side of the river. It's also Kyiv region, and it also was occupied by Russians, but it's to the east, it's to the northeast, and the structure of villages is different there. In Irpin and Brovary and Irpin and Vorsil and Bucha, this is an urban sprawl. There are a lot of, it's really easy to access, and the population density is high. Whereas in Brovary, it's one big village in Brovary, and then the rest is really remote, small, several buildings, villages. So what we're hearing from their eyewitness accounts are really horrible. In some ways, perhaps even more horrible than what we have seen in Bucha. And one of them is, here's an example. There was a young boy in a village, and the Russian troops found Molotov in his home, and so they poured this Molotov cocktail over him and burned him alive. And then people from that village, they're just so traumatized that it's very difficult. They're not capable of even talking about it. So it's very difficult to document these things. And then there are several villages in which, males were executed summarily and females were raped, and some of them were executed afterwards, after rapes. And, it's difficult for me to comprehend how is it that we as humanity missed such a disease in an entire society, because it's not an isolated incident. It's not one crime. It's like regular troops committing en masse horrible atrocities against humanity. And furthermore, the public support for the government in Russia is increasing, according to the polls, with all the caveats about the polls being rigged. But it looks like it's a much bigger problem than we all have even thought. It's truly not a isolated problem. It's a disease. It's I don't know, some variation of an extreme, I don't know, disregard to humans, to nations, to the right for self-determination, to the freedom. It just, it's like slavery or something. It's really awful. And I think Russia has become a state which is it's not just a regime with an aggressive military power. It's beyond that. It's a regime. It's not a regime. It's just substantive number of people with. I don't understand what the Russian culture have done. All this culture that we read the books and the music and the art. It's completely gone with this thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who came to Ukraine and slaughtered others like they were some kind of animals, So, it's difficult for me to cope with this, talking to people who, who had someone shot in front of their eyes. I don't quite know what to do with it, because as a society, as a human kind, we have to address this. It's an existential threat to us now. If this culture can develop under some propaganda, then we're all really, we thought the lessons of the 20th century, the couple of world wars, they are past us and behind us. Now it looks like they are upon us. Now, on the economic side, of course, it's difficult to talk about economics afterwards, but I think I want to send three messages. One message is the recovery should start now. There's a very popular now exercise in the West that, let's wait until the end of the war and then work on the post-war recovery. No, the recovery must be happening now, because a resilient economy now will ensure that there's more people who will survive by the end of the war, and it will be better for everyone. To recover will be easier. That's one thing I want to say. Don't separate it into during the war and post-war. The second one, all these requests for military support and fuel support and logistics and proper weapons, and it has to happen. It's going to be worse for the rest of the world if Ukraine doesn't stop Russia. And Russia is not going to stop through some kind of diplomatic solution. They're out there, if they're treating Ukrainians like that, they probably will be treating Poles and Lithuanians and Turks like that. And after that, it will be a different scale. So, it's in everyone's interest to stop Russia now. So we actually need weapons and we need financial support now. The third one is, I don't understand why the Europe is financing this war by buying gas and oil. I understand it's costly and everyone is concerned about, about how the economy will respond to this, but really take a strategic perspective on this. This is going to be costlier for the world and for the very same countries which refuse to stop buying gas. It will be costlier for them to deal with with Russia, which will come out from this if it is not stopped. If Russia is still making money, they're still profitable. So, that's the third point I want to make on the economy. So recovery now, support now, give the necessary equipment from dual use to military to the economic one. And the third one is stop financing Russia, because they're still making money. And whoever is paying for that is complacent in those atrocities which are happening in Ukraine now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tymofiy. This was an interesting contribution, obviously very clear messaging, and we will discuss the content during the Q&A session. We already have a question on the exact plans for the recovery, so I guess everyone is prepared to plan for recovery now, which is a good thing. So now I welcome the contribution from Dr. Andrei Kirilenko, professor here at Judge Business School. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for having me. I think the main focus, of course, we have of this event is on Ukraine, and I'd like to stay focused on Ukraine. But since Tymofiy asked the question, who are our enemies? Who are the Russians? The way I view them, and I'll just spend a brief period of time. Russian regimes, to me, are the regimes that followed, that emerged from those who won in the Russian Civil War in 1918, 1922. This is effectively regimes that could be described as a millenarian cult, that they practice human sacrifice in order to achieve some sort of a greater future. They kill indiscriminately. This is not the only example of a millenarian cult. Millenarian meaning in 1,000 years, there will be something, communism, new life, something of that sort. They do emerge from time to time, and one of the distinguishing features of these cults is that they practice human sacrifice. As you know, the successive regimes in Russia, Soviet Union, Russian Federation have killed their own people, killed Ukrainians, killed people in Western Europe indiscriminately, as many as they could, because they feel that human sacrifice will bring that greater future. These are not my ideas. These are ideas of historians, some historians who've looked at it, and they resonate with me. And so what I see is, those who have contributed to a greater sort of Russian culture known in the West, well, they've all either died during the civil war in Russia, or they pushed out. There are no more. These are the successors of that haven't really produced anything on that scale. What people in the West know as contributions to the human effort are of that sort. So that's sort of the enemy. And that enemy is going to continue practicing human sacrifice. They'll kill Ukrainians. They'll actually kill and bomb their own people, because they've been doing that. They've been poisoning and killing and sending to jail their own citizens. That's just what they do. And that's what Ukraine is up against. I'd like to spend a little bit of time perhaps describing how I see what Ukrainian economy is. So pre-war, Ukrainian economy to me could be best characterized as a small open economy, really effectively with a rudimentary financial sector. It's a small economy. Just to give you an idea, a ballpark number, the annual GDP, depending on how you count, of Ukraine is somewhere around 170 to 200 billion US dollars. It's not very much money. So when you hear that the US could give Ukraine $13.6 billion, it's It's a lot of money for Ukraine. It's very little money for the US. You know, the market capitalization of Apple, as you know, is over $1 trillion, you know, 5 times the annual GDP value added in Ukraine. Not a correct comparison, but to give you a ballpark number, it's a small economy. It's an open economy. About 65 to 30% of Ukraine's GDP is imports and exports. So it's an open economy. There is a lot of trade going on. It's not a massively open economy, but it's sufficiently open. You know, very open economies would have their imports and exports, you know, 150 to 200%. So Ukraine is not there, but it's getting there. It's open. It's open to the world. And it's an economy without the financial sector, in that, you know, there's no stock market in Ukraine. There's no derivatives market to speak of in Ukraine. Private credit to the economy, that is, you know, credit to the private sector from the banking system of Ukraine, which is effectively generating this credit, is about 19% of GDP. That's tiny. That's very small. So it's an economy that's really, it's small, open. It doesn't really control anything. It doesn't really control any prices globally. It imports all the crisis that it has. Anytime prices fluctuate somewhere, they end up, you know, these repercussions end up in Ukraine. The government has not been, prior to entering into the war, the government hasn't really been running that big of a deficit. The deficit is about 2% of GDP, multiplied by 200 billion, that's about $4 billion. Primarily covered through a bit of issuance in international capital markets and international financial institutions. Again, it's a very, very little, it's a small amount of money for the European for the European Union and for the UK and for the US. So that's sort of the economy. The economy was stable prior to the war. The economy was growing at, you know, depending in, again, on how you count, about 3%. And then the war happened. And when the war happened, as you know, Russia tried to envelope sort of Ukraine all the way from Kyiv, all the way down to Kherson, sort of along sort of the entire, pretty much the entire border there. And that affected a number of sectors quite directly. In Mariupol, two large, you know, steel mills basically stopped operating. You know, Chernobyl nuclear power plant, you know, was operating at smaller capacity. There are other nuclear power plants that were, you know, operating in smaller capacity. Kharkiv is a huge industrial zone, again, was being shelled. Kyiv, a lot of people were leaving and relocating. So there, by some estimates, sort of economic activity decline, or GDP, if you will, decline by anywhere between, or you know, 25 to 50%, depending on how you count. 35% is expected, 35 to 50% as a result of that. Exports have declined. Exports went down by half, according to the recent by recent statements from the Minister of the Economy. Imports dropped down by about 70%. The currency is stable. Money is flowing. You know, financial assistance is flowing from the international financial institutions and bilateral. The financial banking and financial system is actually very stable. In the report produced by the International Monetary Fund in mid-March, associated was the financing agreement, rapid financing agreement that they've produced for Ukraine. They said that the actual National Bank of Ukraine prepared quite well they have, as far as I know, 3 different payment systems. And so payments are operating. People could use cards. They actually had deposits of cash around the country. Banking system is operating. So that is proven to be, knock on wood, quite resilient. So all of that is functioning, seems to be, which is important because, people are moving in very large numbers. Of course, there's been a tremendous amount of devastation in terms of infrastructure. There's a huge movement of people, both out of the country and internally displaced within the country going west. By some estimates, we're talking, if you combine these 2 numbers, every 4th Ukrainian had to relocate, which is on par with Syria. So these are sort of, massive numbers. We're talking, nearly 10 million people, which translates into current loss, future loss of value added. So we, in terms of the situation we're looking at currently, of course, it's hard to predict, but Ukraine entered, prior to war was in a stable condition. The banking and financial sector remains, and the payment system remains stable, remains operational. Definitely one of the things that's very, very clear, at least to me, during this time, and of course I have not been on the ground. I have not observed it on the ground. I've only observed it through by watching, online marathon by various TV stations that is continuously streaming. Is that there is tremendous unity around authority figures. So there is none of the, there's tremendous amount of trust in the president, in the prime minister, in the cabinet, in the governor, in the, mayors, people in charge of, certainly in the military, and that unity and that trust is really, really quite critical for economic purposes as well. Because if people have trust, then things could get rebuilt. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Yes, so we'll move on to Dr. Alexander Rodnyansky. I know that Alexander has just been to Kyiv, so perhaps more observations from the ground will follow as well.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel, and it's nice to hear the perspectives of my esteemed colleagues. I'll try to complement them with what I've seen and done. And in fact, yes, I have been to Kyiv recently. I've been traveling a lot in my capacity as a presidential advisor, which I am right now since 2020. And if that job before was more or less passive, depending on the period that we had, then now it's basically everything that I do. Even the supervisory board membership in Oshad has become much more passive compared to that. So it's really about not just the economy, but all these military topics and basically saving the country, and also international work, lobbying for sanctions, working on sanctions, preparing sanctions, both personal and economy-wide sectoral sanctions. So this is something that I've been working on quite a lot because I happen to know Russia quite well from the inside. So in Ukraine, there aren't that many.
Is it just me, or are we having
remarks about the economy? Because that is, I guess, the main topic of discussion, and I'll try to contribute here to what has been said. So, as Andrei just pointed out, and I think he gave a very detailed and nice summary of what the Ukrainian economy looked like before the war. So I'll pick up from where we stand now. So, like Andrei just mentioned, recent estimates seem to be connection issues. Can you hear me? Okay, good.
We can hear you, but I think we stopped hearing you when you said that recent estimates were, and then
I see. Sorry, there seem to be connection issues. It must be Russian hackers attacking it all. So yes, I said recent estimates of the IMF, just like Andrei mentioned, are that GDP is going to collapse by around 35%. I think that's probably an underestimate because war is ongoing, and all these estimates depend on when the war will stop. Obviously, they have to make some assumptions about that, but from what we're seeing is that Russia is currently starting a covert mobilization in certain regions that will, amass to around 60,000 troops, which they will probably all put into the Donbass. So that seems to be their strategy now. They've given up on Kyiv, they've given up on big cities in the north, and now they want to capture as much as they can in the Donbass area. So obviously that's going to affect these estimates. Now, I can give you some numbers, and most of, what you should also keep in mind is that most of the GDP actually is produced in the north and the east of the country. So that's approximately 55% of our GDP. So that will take a big hit, of course. Now, Russia has already destroyed, and that's worth keeping in mind, roads, bridges, railways, airports, and ports in amounts of $119 billion. So, that's quite a lot of money. To compare, the EU has granted us for the development of infrastructure, just the same type of things like airports, roads, and bridges over the period of 6 years, from 2014 until 2020, they've given us around $103 billion. So that's less. So that just puts things in perspective, how much has already been destroyed. Now, when it comes to monetary policy, so this is what I was initially planning to talk about, and Andrei mentioned this as well. So the focus has really shifted to safeguarding financial stability and ensuring that there's a proper functioning of payment systems in Ukraine, rather than, traditional monetary policy objectives of inflation targeting and so on. So the NBU, the National Bank of Ukraine, has fixed or has kept, the base rate at around 10%, at exactly 10%, that is to say, despite inflation actually going up to around 11 in February. But the exchange rate has been fixed, right? So the exchange rate has now been fixed to around 30 hryvnias per dollar. So they've moved away in this special, in a special time, they moved away from inflation targeting to just essentially fixing the exchange rate and making sure that the financial system just, continues functioning. And so, and making sure that there is liquidity in the financial system. So I'll talk about that more when I actually speak what is happening at the banks from the perspective of Usher Bank as well. So cash withdrawals, for example, have been limited in the banking system to approximately, around $3,300, I think, per month. And also there's been capital flows that have been introduced, capital flow controls that have been introduced. So essentially you can't get money out of Ukraine now like you used to before. And that is, of course, again, part of the whole effort to stabilize the financial system. And it's not really about attracting foreign investment at this point, but we want to make sure that there's no capital flight either. So during these special times, you really have to introduce these drastic measures. So that's just a short summary of what's going on at the NBU, so the National Bank of Ukraine. And as far as banks are concerned, this is a special time period, so it sort of merits a very special radical approach. So as opposed to just macro prudential regulation, that traditionally would involve things like Basel III or aiming towards Basel III, so making sure that our capital adequacy ratios at banks, right? So how much banks have in capital relative to their assets, let's say, making sure that that's high enough and that banks don't violate these ratios, just as liquidity adequacy requirements and so on. Now the NBU has abandoned and abolished a lot of these requirements, and they've abolished the annual assessments for banks, and they've abolished all the penalties that banks would receive in case they violate these economic ratios, as well as the deadlines when these ratios have to be met. So that sounds like it's very unusual, right? Why would you do that? But again, in a crisis time, when banks are all about just making sure that there's liquidity, that cash doesn't get withdrawn too much, that people don't panic, and there's no banking panic, you don't actually want to put this additional pressure on the banking system to make sure that somehow they still have to perform as if everything is normal, right? Because all these ratios and macroprudential requirements, they're useful in normal times to prevent banks from taking on too much risk, right? This is what happened during 2008, 2009 crisis, right? So, the conventional wisdom would say that banks took on too much risk because they weren't well regulated, and still they were systemically important. And then we had a crisis that related to that. And so that's why we need to make sure that in normal times, banks don't take on too much risk, basically. But this is not normal time, right? This is not something that the crisis that we're having, obviously, is not something that's due to risk taking on the part of some institutions. And so we have to actually, doesn't make sense to impose additional, stringent requirements on these banks, on our main banks. And so we're giving them more room, more space to breathe, essentially, by removing these regulations temporarily, especially given that the priorities right now are not about giving out new loans or credit. So that's kind of a short summary of what's going on in the banking sector. And there have been some loans as well, some laws as well that have been introduced to make sure that this is how things work. And also I have to say on the consumer side, so for people that took out credit over the years and took out some loans, there's more capacity now to have loan holidays or to be able to pay back those loans later. Again, so there's kind of both reduced pressure on both sides in the financial system when it comes to the banks, but also on the household side, if you want, or the lender, the borrower side, where these households and agents, we don't want them to be under pressure either, such that they are actually underwater in terms of when it comes to paying back their loans. So that's the short summary and of what's going on. I can give you another few perspectives in terms of our focus at Usher Bank. So Usher Bank has been, we were working very hard on its transformation as part of the supervisory board and as part of the management board renewal. That means basically preparing the bank for privatization. It's a state-owned bank, as it used to be. And its balance sheet doesn't look at all like a normal commercial bank anywhere in Europe or the US. So if you look at Europe, normal commercial banks would have about 60% of their assets being loans. In Ukraine, 60% of our assets were government securities, so sovereign bonds, essentially. Very large exposure to the government sector. And if you look at our credit portfolio, it was basically credit to large state-owned enterprises. So again, the government sector, and a very small fraction of that, went to the private sector. So small and medium enterprises or retail, that is household, essentially mortgage lending. So that has been changing over the years. And so our focus in terms of the retail segment was very much on growing it. We didn't manage to do that yet. And, perversely enough, that's good news right now, because perversely enough, the fact that we have such a high exposure to the government sector in this situation is actually good, because state-owned enterprises are much easier to support for the government during war. If this was all the private sector, then we wouldn't be able to prevent those firms from, defaulting, shedding their workers as easily, essentially, or just keeping or just supporting them essentially during this war. So the fact that there's these state-owned enterprises, that it makes it actually easier for them to survive, because the government can directly control, employment, output to some extent, at least easier than for private firms. And so that's actually, perversely enough, in this situation, it's also good. It's just like with these other issues that I described, like having macroprudential regulation during normal times is good, but during bad times, it's actually unnecessary, perhaps even bad. So again, perversely enough, we're actually in a situation where we can sustain the bank more easily right now, even though it departs from our medium-term priorities completely. So that's the situation. And I will also tell you that surprisingly, in our what's called the micro, small, and medium enterprise segment, which is basically lending to the small firms, we still see very strong credit demand. So that has been, a huge surprise to us, and just a sign of the resilience of the Ukrainian economy and people to some extent. We see still that farmers, especially in agriculture, who take out these loans for their working capital needs, are still doing it. They're still coming to us to some extent, actually, and asking for these working capital loans to make sure that they can go through or just work through the planting season and make sure that everything, that the seeds are actually there and they can finance their operations. So that's a good sign that we're seeing, and it has come as a surprise to us to some extent, but obviously that's a very good sign, speaking for the resilience of our economy. So that's what's happening at the bank level, if you want. Going forward, the big questions that will remain, of course, is once the war is over, what will happen to our portfolio in the long run? How sustainable or healthy will it actually be? And that is kind of a similar issue that European economies might face after the COVID crisis, or are facing already after the COVID crisis, when there was a large-scale support on the part of the government for a lot of firms and households, but especially firms, without really understanding whether these firms will become just delinquent at some point, or might be delinquent, or whether they're actually bankrupt. So that's a distinction between being temporarily unable to finance yourselves, and that means delinquent, and therefore in this case it's good to finance and help these firms. Or will the structure of the economy change so much that after the crisis is over, we've been actually helping firms survive that have become fundamentally bankrupt, and now just there's no reason for them to exist anymore. But at this stage, of course, we don't make these distinctions. We're just focusing on saving as many people, saving as many livelihoods as we can. But fundamentally, going forward, this will be a huge issue, because the structure of the economy might change so much after the war, and a lot of our credit might just become non-performing again, without us really understanding what's going on at this point. So that's what I will say. I will also finally say, just what has the bank been doing? Well, it's just basically been focusing on liquidity, focusing on cash in transit, making sure that Usher Bank is actually a special function in the Ukrainian economy. It's responsible for cash in transit, not just for us, but also for all the other banks right now. We're really capturing a big part of that, if not all. So we need to make sure that cash machines have some cash, that branches have cash, and so on. Around 100 or more branches by now have been destroyed. Our branches have been destroyed. Many of them just occupied. So, for example, in the Donbass, what is happening is they're occupying these branches, and they're transforming them somehow into their local Donbass Bank of the Republic. So we don't actually know what's happening to them, but it's just occupied and taken over. But the branches that we still have under control, which is the vast majority, they're operational and they have cash, and that's what we're focusing on, not obviously on credit growth primarily. So that's what's going on. And yeah, so I will conclude with that. If you want, we can obviously open up the discussion. I do have some things to say with regard to what Tymofiy mentioned at the beginning when it comes to the Russian disease, but that's slightly off topic. It doesn't relate to banking and the economy. But and obviously I have things to say about why the EU doesn't introduce a gas and oil embargo. I have been personally responsible for a lot of the talks and lobbying this in Germany, especially because Germany is the big stumbling block here. And I've been speaking to all the main actors when it comes to these decisions. So I'm happy to talk about that too. But I will conclude here.
Thank you very much. There's a follow-up question from Catherine, who is asking about the capital controls. So her question is, will those 4 million people who have left Ukraine as refugees be able to access funds in Ukraine while they're in other countries? I think that's a popular concern with capital controls, at least the first reaction, definitely, when people hear about it.
Yes, so you can definitely do that. I do that myself. I access my funds from abroad in Usher Bank and so on. So you can do that, but there's a limit on how much you can transfer from deposit to deposit. So if you want to take these funds and transfer them to your deposit in some Western bank, then there is a limit on how much, on how easily and how much you can do that. So that's the short answer.
Yes, good. But it's good to know that Ukrainian refugees are not at disadvantage, and they can still spend their money and, of course, access their funds while they're away from home. So with this, I suggest that we start the discussion. I can see we have different questions, but I do feel that there is this tangential question, so to say. I mean, in a way, it's a core question of why Russia has started this war, and this kind of questions, as you said, about the nature of Russian aggression or the role of Church, of the Russian Orthodox Church in validating Putin's actions. Is very crucial, right? And I don't know whether people who are with us today will have a chance to hear opinions on this matters outside of this meeting. So I just thought, if you have any reflections on the reasons for why do you think Russia is going for such a full-scale invasion in Ukraine, and what are its moving targets?
Well, I can comment on that, but I'm sure Andre has things to say. So,
I'd love to hear your comment.
Okay, so I mean, I was thinking about this a lot, and I think Russia is. I mean, I'll try to be brief. Russia is obviously a deeply authoritarian state, dictatorial state at this point, and decisions are concentrated in the hands of one man, whose psychological state we don't really know what it's like. We can definitely see signs of serious paranoia and just psychological paranoia for years, which is sort of becoming worse with time. We can see signs of isolation. We hear rumors about, perhaps that person is seriously ill and under certain medications, which aggravates aggression. We can't confirm them, but there's signs to suggest that this might actually be true. So, to cut it short, I think the Russian leader, in his sick mind, just decided that basically the economy is done for him. He's never going to be able to achieve anything economic success for Russia, as opposed to the early part of his reign, where he was economically successful and Russia actually grew quite a lot. In the last 8 years, Russia was in stagnation. So Russian incomes were stagnating, and I think the Russian leader realized that there's nothing he can do about that at this stage. So I guess, given that this is a dictatorship, the only issue that is of concern to him now is basically writing history and becoming an imperial legacy, securing his imperial legacy. And so for that, from his perspective, I suppose the calculation was that Belarus is already captured. It was an easy win in 2020 for him, relatively, right? So somehow the population rose up against, the election, which was fraud, but they managed to suppress it. So that's done from his perspective. Kazakhstan is also done. There was a small uprising, but that was easy. And so the only remaining issue from his perspective is Ukraine, right? So given that there is always this imperial ambition. And I think that's the calculation. So, obviously time is running out. He's not becoming younger. Ukraine is becoming stronger. Ukraine's growth was outpacing that of Russia over the years. Ukraine's army is becoming stronger and was already very strong, as we can see. So I guess from his perspective, and I'm just describing what the perspective might be and how we, model it or what we understand it to be. This was the final opportunity, right? Because there was no other lever in Ukraine. We cut all the other levers, all the other spheres of influence that they had on Ukraine. They had their propaganda channels. We turned them off, and thereby we actually aggravated. We increased the chances of a military solution on their part. I'm not saying this was a mistake. I think this is the right decision, but this is just what we're dealing with. We're dealing with this regime, and that's what we understood that was coming. So I think that's probably the perspective. It's just about imperial legacy. This is someone who wants to become a modern Peter the Great, someone who collects all the lands that somehow apparently they consider as belonging to them, and so that's what they did. That's why it happened now.
Yeah, thank you, Alexander. I think that's a very interesting contribution, just because we can see Ukrainians responding to this question in different ways. If I may, like I would say there are maybe three main answers, right? And one is to say that Russian state has always been an aggressive state towards Ukraine, or the states that were there before Ukraine as a name came along, right? Starting with Kyiv, Rus, and continuing through Zaporozhskaya Sich, and so on and so forth, and the states that we had in early 20th century. Another type of response is to say that in Russian culture, there is an element of imperialism that has never been addressed. And so essentially, it's not necessarily Putin who's breeding this idea that he has to capture the empire, but it's actually in part contemporary Russian culture, or perhaps Russian culture that has never faced its own imperialism, that's pushing the president to execute the will of the people. And obviously, this is a much harder perspective to take, and I think it's a much harder perspective for Europeans and people who have never faced these issues before to consider seriously, just because it seems a bit like Ukrainian paranoia. I personally think that there is a lot of truth to it, but of course I understand that perhaps in this position, when we're in the middle of the conflict, it's very hard to trust Ukrainians in their sense of what how Russians feel, and whether Russians themselves are guilty, or whether this is indeed just Putin's war. And then I really like the perspective of Andrei Kirilenko, just because it's the first time I hear about the idea of the cult of sacrifice in relation to Russia. But I do think that it's somewhere in the middle ground, because it doesn't go quite as far as the beginning, the Moscovian start of the Russian empire, but at the same time, it goes back to 1917, where the modern history of today's Russia began. And I guess there is a lot of truth in the idea of sacrifice, and having to sacrifice things for the better future. It's a very interesting perspective. Perhaps, Andrei, you wanted to comment a bit more on that.
It's not my idea. I can't claim it. So there is a professor of history and anthropology at UC Berkeley who has written a number of books. His name is something like Yuri Sletskin, and he's it resonates with me, because I see, I see it in sort of in this sort of broader terms, because like, what's the point of killing 10 million of their own people? Like, why would you do that? Why would you just round up and kill so many people in your own concentration camps? Yes, there is an economic sort of, free labor and all of that, but it's pretty clear that it went beyond that. What's the point of killing, millions of Ukrainians by imposing, tremendous hunger? It's not, other than this, it's a perspective. But having said that, let's just say that this is, for whatever the reasons might be, right? Whatever the reasons might be, let's just say that this is the type of enemy Ukraine is facing. It's a type of enemy, whether it's a cult, whether it's aspiring underdeveloped and whatever, or lost, or empire, whether it's a authoritarian dictatorship. The way we started out this webinar is that they commit senseless atrocities on a massive scale. And so what does it mean for Ukraine then going forward? If that's the type of enemy, if it's the type of enemy that comes in and destroys everything, it destroys infrastructure, it destroys humans, anything that it touches basically perishes, or it has to flee. That's the type of enemy it is. So what does it mean for Ukraine? So we talked a bit about sort of what Ukraine is. It's a small open economy. It's not a wealthy country. If you calculate in terms of sort of GDP per capita, you'll come out to somewhere around, depending on, again, how you run the numbers, let's just say roughly speaking, $4,000 to $4,500 per capita in nominal GDP terms. You can recalculate it in PPP, but that's not much money. Okay, so Ukraine is a poor country. So facing this monstrosity, right, that really doesn't care. I mean, if that's a cult of self-sacrifice, all of these sanctions, I mean, these people who are running this cult are looking at it and they say, oh, fantastic, more of our people will die, which means the future will be here sooner. And the people who don't die are going to be the people who are signing up in droves for our military and security apparatus, because that's the only place they get fed. Fantastic. I mean, that works for us. It's all coming together very, very nicely. The response is exactly the response that we're looking at. We're going to stay strong, we're going to stay aggressive, and anything that we're going to touch in the future is going to perish. So what does it mean for Ukraine going forward? So, I mean, that doesn't leave many choices. Very likely going forward, after these hostilities end, after Russia basically runs out of whatever it has built up, and start building new stuff, Ukraine will probably remain a poor country with an advanced military, because pretty much everything is, and it's going to have very, very highly popularly supported that without the military, what's the point of building roads and bridges? There's no point. What's the point of planting seeds? There's no point. What's the point of, like, developing, like in Mariupol? I'm from Mariupol, right? So over the last several years, sort of the leadership, the mayor of Mariupol, have rebuilt the city, really made it very, very comfortable. I mean, it's a backwards industrial city, so it's never going to be super comfortable, but really rebuilt it, really, it really started looking good. Okay, what's the point of that? It's all gone now. And so going forward, it's probably going to be, and if that's that we're looking at, the economy will need to support that. It will probably remain a democratic country, because I see it being very strongly supported. That will sort of democratically support that type of economic structure, where they, that's just sort of my thinking. Perhaps Alexander or Tymofiy might have thoughts about, like what kind of an economy are we going to be looking at, and what kind of country it's going to be.
I think you touched upon a very interesting, important topic, because Tymofiy mentioned that we can't separate the stages of war and say that we have to rebuild the country once the war is over. And in some ways, I agree with that statement, because we still need to have people preoccupied. Ukraine is a big country. Obviously, we still need to generate GDP, and if people can remain employed, obviously that's preferable. At the same time, I think that we cannot just continue with economic activities. Of course, we can't invest in roads and start rebuilding gas pipes or restoring water supply when the war is still ongoing, because it reminds of the grand building program that was done by President Zelensky just before the war started, right? So much money was poured into building roads, which is a very sensible strategy for any peaceful country. But obviously with war, everything is wiped out, as you've mentioned with Mariupol. So I think it's interesting to think about war economy and whether Ukraine is on its way of establishing a real functioning war economy, and whether we have successful examples of enterprises restructuring their activities, perhaps changing their business models because they are responding to war needs. Have you heard of any things like that?
I would qualify a little bit: defense economy. Mm-hmm. So an economy that could support a massive defense effort, and the economy is basically going to be pretty much crippled by supporting the effort that's going to be needed on that scale, because again, the enemy that it's facing, but the the fact that it's facing that type of enemy, it will just basically leaves very little choice. That's what needs to be done. And defense effort on the scale where it just becomes, very, very clear that that the defense capabilities are there. I mean, in terms of very standard sort of examples is Israel in the first probably 10, 15 years of its existence, not the Israel now, but the Israel in the first, I would say even 20 years of its existence before the Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur War was one of many, many wars, as you know. It was the war which nearly destroyed Israel, in which Israel was victorious at the end, but it nearly destroyed it. It was this close. And after that war, my understanding is, I mean, not a geopolitical expert, we all are, I guess now, is that that war made it clear to Israel that it cannot actually defeat conclusively defeats its Arab neighbors, and made it clear to the Arab neighbors that they cannot conclusively defeat Israel. But it took, and after that there was a lasting sort of peace that is lasting until now, was skirmishes around it. South Korea, again, in the first 10, 15 years of its existence, facing a monstrous enemy just to its north. Probably Israel is closer to that because it's effectively surrounded on all sides, right, by the enemies. And so, however, it has a very significant, ability to get, economic and military aid on one side, which has been helping it quite a bit. So that's these are just, but I don't think we need to. I think Ukraine is going to develop its own example for everyone to see. I mean, it's pretty clear that things are going the way that they're going, in a way that is very, very unexpected to others. It is also, a number of commentators have said it, that the traditional mechanisms that were established after World War II, during which time Israel was also established, of sort of peace and economic development, are inadequate for these times. The International Red Cross takes a month before it could do anything. The United Nations, has Russia in its Security Council, that vetoes everything. The IMF has done things faster, interestingly, and the World Bank, I think, have done things faster, but I think they've been gearing up for that a bit more. But that's, NATO is kind of like, yeah, you're kind of on your own.
Definitely.
So whatever it is going to be, I think there will be Ukraine plus a wholesale overhaul of like these sort of multilateral organizational efforts that have proved, much less adequate that we're all hoping for.
That definitely feels very true to me. But talking about current economy in Ukraine, there's a question from Paul Brown. To what extent is Ukraine dependent on Russian gas, both directly for use and as fuel, and as income from transit through Ukrainian pipelines? Can it be replaced rapidly? Obviously, this comes at a time when we're discussing EU embargo on Russian gas and oil after seeing the atrocities in Bucha and other places in Kyiv region. And I think it's a very valid point. Can we ourselves avoid using Russian oil and gas, since we're asking our partners?
So do you want me or Andrei?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so yeah, so this is a good question, actually. Quite, there's a short and there's a long answer to it. So strictly speaking, first of all, if you look strictly speaking at the numbers, even for 2020 or before, we are 0% dependent on Russian gas. So we don't actually import Russian gas. We take it, you remember there's this reverse thing, where we reverse the gas from our Western partners, and it comes back to us, but it's, it's actually Russian gas that they have. So this is a little bit of a perverse situation, but that's the short answer number one. Short answer number two to the second part about the transit is that we're getting, by the new contracts, we're getting about 1.27, so close to about $1.3 billion per year in terms of fees from the transit until 2024. That is less than it used to be before, because Russia has obviously negotiated their way through and tried to blackmail us and so on. We used to be getting 3 billion, and before that it was even more. But that's what we're getting now. So about 1.2, $1.3 billion per year in terms of transit fees. Now, is that a lot? In terms of our revenue side of our budget, it's not really much. It's about 2 to 3%, depending on which year you look, of our revenue side of the budget. So if that falls away, strictly speaking, that's surmountable. We can live without that. But the big problem is, and here is kind of where the meat and the detail comes in, is actually in the whole distribution network that we have within Ukraine for gas. And the way I understand it, and I've looked at this topic to some extent, is that our own distribution network that we use to distribute and supply gas to our population and also our industry relies to a large extent on this transit being sustained. So in other words, if this transit of gas were to disappear, then the distribution network and the supply network that we have, the pipes and the actual hardware, would fall away and be damaged to some extent. So it wouldn't actually allow for an easy functioning. So that is where it's important, not necessarily in terms of the revenue side, but it's important for the actual for us to be actually maintain this whole infrastructure going forward. Now, the gas people probably have some backup plans in case this happens, but that's the short answer to this. And if I may just comment on a few other things that were mentioned before, about what expects Ukraine, what Ukraine can expect going forward. So I'm actually a bit more optimistic here. So I don't think we'll just have a war economy or a defense economy going forward. I think the benefit is that or the sort of upside of everything that's happening is that the world has really consolidated around the support of Ukraine, and that we will be getting a lot of financial support and also political support, and also support with transforming institutions in Ukraine going forward. And that is a momentum that we have to use to really push through the transformation that has been hard over the years. And I hope that will happen. So I'm actually optimistic when the war is over, hopefully at some point soon. And when we'll be victorious, I'm actually very optimistic that Ukraine will now really enjoy a lot of global support and have a lot of potential in terms of developing more broadly, not just on the military perspective. But of course, there is this issue of what will happen with Russia. And here it is, paramount that we stick to our objectives. First of all, we have to be strong militarily, as strong as we can get. And here it's not just defensive, but also what's called offensive weapons, although everyone understands that it's basically weapons. But when we say offensive weapons, it's, tanks, artillery, cannons, all sorts of stuff that we need to get in order to recapture the territory that's now occupied. So that will, that's imperative, and this is what we're trying to convince our partners to provide as soon as possible. And the other part, of course, is the oil and gas embargo. So, by the way, in 2022, so this year, Bloomberg has just put out a projection that Russia is actually set to earn $320 billion from oil and gas sales, which is a third more than last year, just because of the rise in gas prices and oil prices. So that's something to keep in mind, and that's what they're using to finance the war effort. So we need to stop that, and this is why the embargo is so important. It's very hard to push through politically, but why is the EU so reluctant? Well, the answer is because they're thinking about short-term economic costs that would spring from this, and we're telling them to.
Sorry, it's just many people keep asking you about the situation in Germany, because you briefly mentioned that you were involved in negotiations. Could you add a bit more light on that?
Yeah, so that's what I'm basically, one of my priorities now is basically talking to the Germans. Yeah, so unfortunately, the German side is very worried about the short-term costs, and they have various projections. The industry is very worried here about what it would mean if gas were to be cut off. Jobs would get lost, and it would cost percentages in terms of GDP and so on. But we keep telling them, look, first of all, there's disagreements in terms of how much that would cost in the short run. There's actually serious studies now that show that it doesn't have to be as disastrous. The costs can be quite sizable, but they're manageable. And you can use all sorts of methods to adjust, to substitute away from Russian oil and gas, especially the oil. That's easier to do in the short run. So that's number one. Number two, it's much more important to think about what would happen in the medium run. If Russia can sustain its war effort, and I just mentioned how much they're earning, then this might escalate, not just in Ukraine, but beyond Ukraine. And then it's going to be NATO involved, and it's going to be German soldiers dying, not just Ukrainian ones and Italian ones or whoever. So if that's what they want to risk, then they should continue as they are doing. But if not, then they obviously need to dry out the war effort now, currently, whatever that costs. So that's basically the argument. But the short answer to why Germany is reluctant, it's because of the costs. It's because of the economic cost. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
If I might perhaps add to that before Tymofiy, we have Tymofiy with that, because from my understanding is, again, not being an expert on it, but the threat to turn off gas is unsubstantiated, because you can't really turn it off. It's being pumped under pressure. It's connected to where it's being generated. You either have to pump it into storage, which you can do, or you need to burn it somewhere in Siberia. So in principle, there is no point to turn it off, and that's what Alexander also said. That pressure in the Ukrainian system is also critical for how the gas is distributed throughout Ukraine as well. But there are sort of technical issues that I think at least some Ukrainian negotiators like Lana Zerkali and others have been communicating to European politicians, that there is this sort of potentially misunderstanding of what that means to not be reliant upon it. I mean, you can still receive Russian natural gas, but just don't pay Russia for it. Accumulate what you would have paid Russia on special accounts that would then go towards the rebuilding of Ukraine. I mean, they can't turn it off, or they just burn it. There will be like, what looks like, massive gas fires over Western Siberia, right? So that's my understanding. Is that your understanding as well, Alexander?
So I think they do have a capacity to basically drive down the pressure and the supply of gas through our routes. And we've seen them do that before, in several crises. In 2005, it happened at some point, not entirely, but that's what they did. And remember, that was the whole plan with Nord Stream 2 to basically circumvent Ukraine. So I think there is some capacity. You can probably, in terms of the wording, you can, I'm not sure how to phrase it correctly, burning the gas or cutting off the gas, but for sure they can go around Ukraine such that we're basically, that was their original plan. So yeah, but of course, if the embargo happens, then there's not going to be any Russian resources, energy sources coming in. So that's the plan, and no payment for them either. But we'll see. Yeah.
How likely do you think is it?
So from my understanding, and this is what, we've been at least trying to, that's what I've tried to argue and convince people, in the political echelons here at the very top, is that at the very least they should, introduce a stepwise embargo, starting with oil. Oil is easier to substitute away. Oil can come from Qatar, Middle East, and so on, and there's ports and infrastructure to import it quite easily. So that's step number one. The gas is, in fact, really much harder to substitute away from in the short run. It's easier to do in the medium run. But Germany doesn't even have a LNG terminal. You know, Italy has 3, but even though they are also very dependent on Russian gas imports. But Germany was just completely reliant, you know, lived in this illusion that Russia was somehow a reliable partner. So they're actually, you know, in this rather bad situation, for example. But is it likely? I think, look, in the medium run, they're definitely going to do it. There's no question. They're definitely going away from all Russian energy imports. But we need this to happen now, because the war is happening now. That's the point. And people are dying. I was just talking to, you know, very high officials in the chancellor's office a couple of days ago, and then the next 2 days later there was Bucha, and I was telling them, you know, what's at stake. So pressure is rising on them, but you know, do they have the urgency to do it? I'm not sure, but at least stepwise. And then you can also tax gas. You know, that's going to remove some of the profits that they're making the Russian side. So there's all sorts of stepwise intermediate scenarios that you can pursue, and I think that will be very useful at this point. But I will also comment on something that Tymofiy said at the very beginning, which I think is important about this whole Russia disease issue. Sorry if I can make this tangent. I think that's important. This is something that I was thinking about a lot. So I think, you know, the best analogy, whatever, no matter which way you turn this issue, is with you know, Nazi Germany when you look at Russia these days. And but the big difference, and what I'm really concerned about, is that in Germany, after World War II, you know, Germany was defeated, and then there was this huge process of reassessment, of rethinking on the part of the Germans, you know, and this just realization of their guilt about, you know, the Holocaust, the war, and so on. I don't see any remnant of that in Russia whatsoever at this point, you know, and I can't fathom or even try to realize or imagine how this is going to come to that point in Russia at this stage. And that's what's scaring me the most, because Russian society is in a stage where it's not just, you know, unwilling to rethink certain issues or reassess them. It's actively belligerent, right? So it sees itself as surrounded by enemies, and it doesn't want to give up, right? It just wants to increase pressure. So if you look at the reactions that we seem to get from Russia on the withdrawal from the north of Kyiv, you see these people shouting and you know, asking for more violence, essentially. So, you know, how do we get from this stage where we are now to a stage where Russia starts to question things? That's the big issue for me, and I'm very pessimistic when it comes to that. So, but this leaves no other options for us. We still have to make sure that they have no money, so they can't finance the war effort. So that means sanctions now, and we need to make sure we are militarily as strong as we can possibly get, right? So NATO doesn't want to get involved, so at least, you know, give us all the facilities and capabilities such that we can defend ourselves. So there's no other way. But these solutions, they both help us end the war, and they also, in the long run or in the medium run, you know, solve the issue of Russia coming out of this authoritarian equilibrium somewhere towards, you know, something that's perhaps different. I'm not going to lie, I don't expect democracy, you know, being established there, but we have to get them out of, you know, we have to destabilize the regime somehow, you know. So I mean, so it's both things that we're pursuing.
I'd like to perhaps a little bit qualify my effort. Tymofiy, I made some points about what kind of Ukraine do you think is going to be there, and the points I was making that it's going to be, in my opinion, there's not much of a choice given a belligerent and sort of barbaric environment that it faces, is to be a poor country with a strong military. Now, what I'd like to say is that it doesn't have to be forever. I think this defense effort basically has to sustain Ukraine for long enough until there is a political window of opportunity for Ukraine to join NATO or something like NATO, where it will have a nuclear umbrella over it. And then it will revert back, it could revert back to a peace economy. It doesn't have to, Ukraine doesn't have to be forever, you know, a poor economy with a strong defense. It just has to be that long enough until there is a window of opportunity, which, you know, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia have realized when they had a chance. They were very clear that what they were doing, and Ukraine just need to sustain itself until that point. So, but until that point, if nobody with sort of nuclear weapons is protecting Ukraine from Russia, which is a nuclear power, it just needs to protect itself and basically have the economic effort supporting the defense. So just wanted to qualify that. But Timothy, I think Alexander disagrees somewhat, and Timothy may completely disagree.
Would you like to comment, Timothy?
Sure, but you know, can you give me some guidance on a specific question or something? Kind of agree and can discuss all of this, but yeah.
Where do you see Ukraine go in terms of once Russia runs out of enough weapons, there will be some sort of a truce in this environment, and then what kind of an economy would Ukraine be, and where do you sort of see it going? Just you know.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So I think it's a different war from what we have seen. For multiple reasons. One, it's really close this time to Europe. Maybe not to all Europe. It's still abstract in France and Germany, but it is close to Poland and to the Baltic countries. Ukraine is large geographically, and Russia has engaged in a very extensive front or exercise. So, you know, there'll be villages coming, you know, there'll be Mariupols, there will be Buchas, there will be Chernigiv, there will be villages and names we don't even know ourselves in Ukraine, which will become symbols. And partly it's because Russia at this point has overextended itself, and they have a complete collapse of the chain of command in remote areas, where some of the less trained military or incompetent military is not that willing to fight and is not very disciplined. So these guys will continue to commit horrible acts, and we'll be learning about them. That's a different war, just too close to Europe. And that will create a lot of pressure on Europe to actually indeed impose embargo in the beginning on oil, later on gas. Later there will be closed skies. And we have seen a lot of dynamics, you know, something which people were afraid to give to Ukraine, like javelins or stingers were given. And now the president Zelensky was asking for tanks, and now they will be given at some point. Jets will be coming too. This war is not going to end tomorrow. It's not going to end in several weeks, and maybe it's not going to end in months, just because, you know, it took everyone 2 years to settle down to some kind of status quo with the east of Ukraine with a very limited contact line. Now you have at least 300,000-400,000 people mobilized in Ukraine, and maybe similar numbers engaged in Russia, maybe smaller, but it will take, even if we stop tomorrow and sign a truce, there will be you know, a long time needed to stop. It's just inertia. So that means I start thinking about, I agree with Paul Krugman on this, and I start thinking about Ukraine as a Great Britain during World War II, before the US formally entered the war. There'll be more and more supplies coming eventually from the west of Ukraine, from the rest of the world, and Ukraine will be the far front. I don't think there'll be a truce. It's just we're past that. Not after the, you know, 10 more villages like Bucha and cities like Mariupol. And when Chernigiv will be, you know, I have people in Chernigiv, so things which are happening there are gonna be nasty. All right, so that's going to be a long time, and Russia will be isolated and will respond by aggression, and so there will be pressure to implode. Whether Russia will resort to WMD, that's an open question, but it's not a zero probability, because everything we have thought Russia wouldn't do, it has done. So if at this point, we're making an assumption that they will not use something, they will, or they are likely to, or they might. So in that sense, I have a different, my scenario is that eventually Russia will implode and Ukraine will have to survive until Russia implodes. And that's going to be during this conflict, this war. That just means that this war might be long. And then the world will be somewhat different after that. Actually, having difficulty already, we're facing some issues in Hungary with the similar symptoms. You know, it's not Putin per se, which is the problem, it's the people which are willing to elect and re-elect, which are willing to live in non-democracy. Democracy has its flaws, but democracy is discipline and device. In Ukraine, it's impossible to imagine non-democracy. And I think if we have some truth, it's just an episode. It's a punctuation. It's an episode. It's a stop. It's a pause in the same war. So it just let's say we have a truce, and then we'll have 5 years, and then there'll be next time Russia will not make the mistake, and Ukraine will be prepared even more than now. So the violence will be degrees of what it is now. And so that means that we have to resolve this issue now, and that's in the interest of everyone. I also don't think that Russia is that interested in Odessa. I think they're cutting the line to Moldova. That I might be wrong, but that's my view. And if they connect to Moldova, they can destabilize the southern Central Europe or the southern Eastern Europe anytime they want. And on the north, they will be cutting at some point a corridor to Kaliningrad. That's probably an aspiration at some point. Which way it's going to be done, I don't know. But essentially, we are facing a very different world in which Russia, an aggressive regime, and nukes, and 3 types of strategic economic weaponry all together make Central Europe and maybe Europe overall a dangerous place and not sustainable world. The 3 economics weapons which are there, one we have seen is energy. The other one, which is less understood, but if you think for a moment about it, it will become clear, it's logistics. Because China, north of China, trades through land with Europe. And Russia, by destabilizing the region from Georgia to Baltics, is able to control the logistics. And the third area of economic warfare is actually food security. If Ukraine cannot compete with Russia because it cannot conduct planting season, then there will be a disruption of supply and harvest. Currently, 385 million people in the region relies outside of Ukraine on Ukraine for food security. This is 5% of the world population. It's mostly North Africa, Middle East, and some of the Asian countries. Destabilizing food supplies in these areas will lead to political instability. Because food, unlike ideology, is actually threatening for the regimes, even non-democratic regimes. So if people are hungry, the revolutions are more likely. Propaganda is less effective when people are hungry. So Russia will actually have enough in its toolkit to claim to become an economic superpower. We can discuss whether Russia is a superpower or not, but at least it matters now geopolitically. Out of all countries which matter geopolitically, this is the only country which uses force. China, for example, still uses economy. Europe uses economy, the UK uses economy, North America uses economic tools, first of all, to extend influence. And so Russia, in the longer run, to become an empire, really has to become an economic superpower. And it needs to control trade. So it has to have access to the Baltic Sea and to the Black Sea, and not just to Odessa, but all the way to Bosphorus. Once it has it, then it will be able to trade, and it can claim control over logistics in Central Europe, and then can have an aspiration for economic superpower. Now, it doesn't have to be, actually control. It could be pseudo sovereignty that it exercises in, in satellite countries where it controls the foreign policy. I think it has been successful in doing it in Hungary, more recently in Georgia, and really has become undiplomatic, given my connections with the Belarus. It really has truly left only pseudo sovereignty. Kazakhstan. These countries don't control their own foreign policy, and they don't control internal affairs, and they don't control military. At least the positions there have to be aligned with Russian position. So Russia can use this model to try to control the Central Europe. And once it's done, then it has a chance at becoming an economic superpower. So we are really looking at something much more important. But unfortunately, I will have to run off the call because of an emergency. My apologies. Okay.
Thank you very much, Timothy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hope you're okay.
It was much more grand scale contribution on how Russian invasion can look like in future if Russia ever threatens other countries. And definitely it's a very valid point that Russian influence already extends to so many countries. And it's not only with direct measures of warfare that Russia tries to affect countries. It's in some ways we can see that what Ukraine experiences now is a punishment of sorts for not willing to join Russia in its attempt to reintegrate countries together into its grand empire. But just because we are running out of time, and obviously you're also all busy people, I don't want to keep you here forever. I wanted to pose a last remark on the subject. This is about the Marshall Plan for Ukraine. So just to talk about something positive towards the end, I think we all agree on many topics. But do you see Ukraine in the European Union? What do you think is the function of, or the role of the European Union and EBRD and other international institutions in reconstructing Ukraine, hopefully after the conflict is over?
Perhaps Alexander is closer to it than I am.
Yeah, so I can comment shortly on that. So as I mentioned before, I'm actually more or less optimistic once the war is over, conditional on being I believe we will be victorious, so I'm conditional on being over soon. I'm actually very optimistic when it comes to the prospects of Ukraine. And we are already discussing plans for a restoration fund, a Marshall Plan, if you want. So I'm actually involved in some of this too. There's a lot of willingness on the part of our Western partners to help here. And we're actually also talking about the sources of funds that will be used. So one of the ideas that, for example, I had was to, use some of the arrested wealth of the Russian elites to put at least a fraction of that into the fund. This is billions of dollars, especially when it comes to liquid wealth that we could use. So, but that's still ahead of us. And, there's jurisdictions and different laws in different countries that can allow or make that harder, depending on which country you look at. So for example, in Britain, that's relatively easy to do. In the EU, that's much harder. But anyway, so there is a plan for, having a Marshall plan for Ukraine. That's already in the works, and it's obviously concerning infrastructure, rebuilding roads and bridges, all the destroyed facilities that we have. And by the way, a lot of our military production facilities have also been destroyed. So this whole idea of us having a vibrant defense or war economy, if you want, is unfortunately not quite in touch or in sync with reality, because the Russians have been, very effective at destroying our military production capabilities, unfortunately. So that will also have to be rebuilt, provided we can do that. There's, we will be able to do that for sure, but the Russians are obviously, they have some demands when it comes to our military. But that will certainly happen. I'm sure that in terms of economic prospects, once the war is over, Ukraine has very big potential. So I'm relatively optimistic, and I agree with you. We should conclude on that optimistic note when it comes to this.
Thank you. That's really great to hear. I see there is a lot of willingness on on the part of the European Union to also proceed with the discussions on the EU membership of Ukraine and granting.
Oh yes, if I can comment on that just briefly. So the EU has already clearly sent a signal that we're gonna be part of the. They've started considering our candidacy. So remember, EU, the process of joining the EU has 4 stages. Where first you apply for your candidacy, then you're given your candidacy status, then you start negotiations. That's the longest part. And then there's the accession at the end. And so that part with the negotiations can take years. It usually took years for most of the member states. And so in our case, and this is a sequential linear process, so it means there's this set of Copenhagen criteria which need to be fulfilled for a country to join the EU. Those are basically democratic institutions, economic institutions, and just being a functional economy essentially in country. So, and that means, doing certain reforms, and those need funds, and so on, those need implementation. So that is a linear process. Once a set of reforms is complete, you move on to the next. And so that's where the negotiation process is so vital, and that's why it's kind of complicated as well. You need to set out this roadmap. And for us, that will obviously mean a lot of things. So when it comes to fighting corruption, building judicial, the judicial institutions that we need, we're already started with that over the years, actually, but there's still, some way to go, of course. So I'm still optimistic, again, when it comes to that, because now there will be a different imperative, both within and outside Ukraine, a different, level of support. So it's important not to squander that when it comes to us. Our politicians and our diplomats and our deep state, hasn't been always very helpful over the years before the war. But this will be a time when everybody will have to be, as diligent and as serious about this as they can possibly be, because if we squander the support that we will enjoy and that we're already enjoying now, then that will be a historic tragedy, really. But provided we can deliver, and we can do that, and it's actually in our best interest to do that, and we have all the support now, I think we will join the EU at this point for sure, at some point, some point down the road. Obviously, it's going to take years. It doesn't happen overnight. So.
Tymofiy just texted me. Unfortunately, has to rush off to do things. He gets asked, but he asked very kindly, asked me to apologize for his sudden exit. I think he's doing something very, very important, and also asked me to mention the various humanitarian efforts and support efforts to let people know about it. We're doing it in Cambridge. I think Kyiv School of Economics is running a campaign as well. So basically, in any way you can help, please do and share it with others.
Thank you very much, Andriy, and thank you everyone for listening to us today. Thank you, dear panelists, for joining us and for sharing your views. It's very important that we have these conversations, and there are so many questions that we didn't answer, but hopefully we've clarified quite a bit. Thank you for all your insights and in finding time really in this time of war. I know it's very hectic and everyone tries to do everything, so it's very it's worth a lot that you could join us. Thank you very much.